Welcome back to Crypto Equation, and today we need to talk about something that has been quietly forming beneath the surface of global finance, something most people are not prepared for, something that is not about price predictions or hype, but about structural change that is set to collide directly with the digital asset world in 2026. People keep asking why 2026 keeps appearing in conversations about global settlement, modernization, regulatory alignment, institutional readiness, and digital infrastructure upgrades. But the truth is simple. 2026 is shaping up to be the year when multiple financial timelines merge, and when those timelines merge, the world will not look the same. And XRP sits at the center of those timelines, whether the market realizes it or not. Because the shock coming in 2026 is not one single event. It is a convergence of modernization, a convergence of policy, a convergence of technology, a convergence of institutional deployment, a convergence of liquidity transformation, a convergence of digital value movement finally stepping into mainstream financial rails. And the question is simple: are you ready for what happens when all of this collides? To understand the XRP shock of 2026, we must begin with the reality that global finance is not preparing for change. It is already deep inside the change. The old systems are fading, the new systems are testing, and the transition phase is nearly complete. But most people cannot see it because they look at charts and ignore infrastructure. They look at volatility and ignore architecture. They look at price and ignore purpose. The truth is, the world is rebuilding the foundation of money itself. And 2026 is where the rebuild becomes visible. Every major region is upgrading systems simultaneously, something that has not happened in decades. Europe shifting to instant payment requirements. Asia developing real-time settlement corridors. The Middle East building intelligent liquidity hubs. Africa adopting new rails. North America modernizing clearing and messaging. Latin America integrating cross-border digital systems. This synchronized modernization leads to one unavoidable outcome: global liquidity must become real-time. And that is where XRP enters the conversation. XRP was built for the world emerging in 2026, not the world that existed in 2017. Its role becomes clearer with every upgrade, every regulatory step, every institutional pilot, every settlement framework, every messaging standard alignment. And as the global system moves closer to activation, the market becomes more unaware because the transformation is happening where retail cannot see it in institutional infrastructure. This is why the shock of 2026 will feel sudden, even though it has been building for years. Because people do not feel a transformation until the moment the transformation touches their daily life. And when financial systems flip to real-time rails, when tokenized assets become normal, when instant global settlement becomes standard, people will suddenly realize why assets built for this reality matter more than they ever understood. And this is the core of the 2026 shock. The world will finally begin operating on the rails XRP was designed for. The moment the world needs real-time liquidity is the moment the world rediscovers the purpose of assets built for speed neutrality and interoperability. But before we reach that point, the transformation itself must be understood. The first transformation is regulatory alignment. For years, digital assets have existed in uncertainty. Governments moved slowly, institutions moved cautiously, markets moved emotionally. But 2026 is the year several major regulatory frameworks are scheduled to be fully implemented. It is the year clarity expands across jurisdictions. It is the year digital asset classifications stabilize. It is the year the fog begins to lift. This clarity does not guarantee price, but clarity guarantees something far more important: activation. Because institutions cannot deploy capital or integrate technology without regulatory structure. 2026 is the year structure appears. The second transformation is messaging standard modernization. ISO messaging is not about buzzwords. It is about restructuring the language of global finance. When the world speaks the same financial language, interoperability becomes mandatory. Once interoperability is mandatory, settlement must evolve because speed becomes non-negotiable. The third transformation is liquidity efficiency. The world can no longer afford slow liquidity. Corporate treasuries cannot wait. Central banks cannot wait. Cross-border settlement cannot wait. Real-time liquidity becomes the global expectation. This is why XRP's design makes more sense in 2026 than it did in 2018. Because the world is finally operating in the environment XRP was built for. Now let us move into the deeper structural forces that make 2026 a turning point. The first structural force is the collapse of outdated systems. The financial world relies on rails that were never meant to survive the digital era. These systems break during volatility. They break during global shocks. They break during liquidity stress. Upgrading them is no longer optional. The second structural force is the rise of tokenized markets. Every major institution is preparing to tokenize everything of value, from bonds to foreign exchange flows to financial instruments. Tokenized assets do not use slow rails. They require instant settlement. They require neutral liquidity. They require interoperability. They require assets designed for movement, not storage. The third structural force is the emergence of global liquidity hubs. These hubs will act as the nervous system of digital finance, and they require digital assets that are efficient enough to move instantly and neutral enough to avoid geopolitical friction. The fourth structural force is automation. Artificial intelligence will not wait days for settlement. Automated markets will not wait for slow messaging. Intelligent payment networks will not operate on outdated rails. The future is real-time everything. And when the world becomes real-time, XRP's role becomes visible. Now let us explore why 2026 is not a guess. It is a structural deadline, because several global systems reach finalization or activation around that year, clearing modernization, completing major messaging migrations, completing corporate treasury automation phases, completing settlement infrastructure upgrades, completing pilot testing transitions, completing and cross-border liquidity frameworks, activating. This does not mean XRP's price will explode, but it means XRP's relevance will shift from speculative to structural. And when relevance becomes structural, the market sees the asset differently. Now let us break down the psychological shock of 2026. The shock is not that XRP suddenly becomes valuable. The shock is that the world suddenly realizes why it was built. The shock is not that institutions adopt digital rails. The shock is that institutions quietly relied on them before retail noticed. The shock is not that global settlement becomes instant. The shock is that the transition happened behind the scenes before the world felt the impact. 2026 will feel like a financial awakening, and the majority will be unprepared. Now let us explore the phases leading to the shock. Phase 1 is denial. People believe the old system is fine. They see no urgency. They assume modernization can wait. Phase 2 is resistance. Institutions and governments realize the old system cannot support the digital economy, yet remain cautious about adopting new rails. Phase 3 is acceleration. Multiple regions begin upgrading simultaneously. Tokenization pilots expand. Instant payment frameworks become mandatory. Phase 4 is implementation. The upgrades reach activation. Phase 5 is revelation. The public suddenly realizes the system has changed. 2026 is positioned between Phase 4 and Phase 5. This is where the shock occurs, because when people realize the system has changed, they also realize the assets built for the system carry new meaning. Now let us explore the deeper layers behind XRP's alignment with 2026. XRP is aligned with instant settlement because it settles at the speed the new system demands. XRP is aligned with liquidity efficiency because it can bridge disconnected networks. XRP is aligned with interoperability because it is independent from any single jurisdiction or banking network. XRP is aligned with tokenization because it can settle tokenized assets across borders. XRP is aligned with digital identity frameworks because it settles predictably and transparently. XRP is aligned with AI-driven finance because it supports automated settlement flows. This alignment creates inevitability. Relevance rises as the world shifts into the rails XRP was designed for. Now let us explore the long-term holder perspective, because long-term holders sense the 2026 shift intuitively. They feel the acceleration. They recognize the modernization. They see the global patterns. They understand the difference between noise and structural change. The shock is not coming for them. The shock is coming for those who never understood the architecture. Now let us explore the emotional side of the shock. People will feel confused when the financial system behaves differently. People will feel overwhelmed when settlement becomes instant. People will feel unprepared when tokenized markets become standard. People will feel surprised when institutions rely on digital liquidity flows. People will feel lost when old assumptions collapse. And during this confusion, the world will begin searching for clarity, and assets that were dismissed for years will suddenly be reevaluated. This is why 2026 becomes a defining moment, not because something magical happens, but because the world wakes up to what already happened. In the second half of this script, we will explore the liquidity implications, the institutional adoption timeline, the settlement pathways, the hidden signals, the cross-border transformation, and the psychological shift that will determine who survives the 2026 shock and who gets left behind. Because now that we have uncovered the institutional infrastructure and psychological patterns pointing directly toward 2026, we need to step even deeper into the forces that will shape the XRP shock, because this moment will not be created by hype or speculation. It will be created by necessity. Global finance is moving into a reality where settlement speed is not optional, where liquidity flexibility is not optional, where interoperability is not optional, and where digital value movement is the core of economic function. The systems that cannot adapt will be replaced. The systems that can adapt will dominate. And assets built for these systems will become increasingly relevant as the world approaches 2026. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we must begin with the global liquidity cycle. Liquidity cycles define the health of the financial world. They determine how money flows, how markets react, and how institutions position themselves. In the old world, liquidity cycles were slow, predictable, and geographically isolated. In the new world, liquidity cycles are global, instant, and interconnected. This is where XRP becomes central, because XRP is not only a digital asset, it is a liquidity mechanism. And in 2026, the world transitions from local liquidity to global liquidity. Global liquidity requires neutral assets. Neutral assets require interoperability. And interoperability requires infrastructure that is not tied to one nation, one bank, or one political system. This is why XRP matters. Now let us explore the settlement flow transformation. In the legacy system, settlement is delayed. Funds move but do not settle instantly. This delay creates friction. It creates risk. It creates inefficiency. The new world eliminates that delay. But instant settlement cannot function without settlement assets capable of completing transactions at the speed of digital messaging. Banks cannot move fiat instantly across borders without intermediaries. Corporations cannot move global liquidity without bridging assets. Tokenized markets cannot settle instantly without a neutral settlement layer. XRP sits precisely in this layer. This is why 2026 becomes a revealing moment. The rails are changing. The architecture is changing. The expectations are changing. And once the system activates, the demand for real-time settlement assets shifts dramatically. Now let us examine the institutional curve. Institutions move slowly until they move all at once. They test for years. They run pilots quietly. They observe regulatory shifts. They wait for global frameworks. And then when the conditions align, they deploy instantly, because institutions do not scale gradually. They scale immediately. 2026 is where institutional timelines converge. Many pilots complete that year. Many regulatory structures finalize that year. Many payment system upgrades activate that year. And many liquidity corridors open that year. The public will not see the preparation. They will only feel the activation. And this activation is the shock. Now let us explore the cross-border corridor transformation, because global corridors are the bloodstream of the international economy. In the old system, corridors depended on pre-funded accounts. In the new system, corridors depend on real-time liquidity. This transition breaks the dependence on slow rails. It breaks the dependence on intermediaries. It breaks the dependence on trapped capital. XRP was designed for this moment, and when these corridors go live, the world will need assets capable of bridging currencies instantly and securely. The shock is not that banks begin using new technology. The shock is that the technology becomes invisible. People will not realize that cross-border payments have gone real-time. People will not realize that liquidity is being sourced dynamically. People will not realize that settlement is happening on digital rails. People will not realize that the world quietly migrated to a system XRP was built for. Now we must examine the psychological inversion that will occur in 2026. For years, retail investors looked to price for validation. They wanted charts to confirm their beliefs. They wanted predictions to reinforce their confidence. But the inversion happens when the system validates the purpose, not the price. The shock is when the world sees the purpose. Purpose creates relevance. Relevance creates demand. Demand creates positioning. And positioning creates clarity. This is why long-term holders speak differently. They are not waiting for an explosion. They are waiting for recognition. They understand that the moment the system needs the technology is the moment the technology becomes relevant. Now let us explore the final major force behind the 2026 shock, the failure of outdated liquidity infrastructure. Liquidity stress events are increasing globally. Banks are struggling to maintain reserves. Corporations are struggling to move money efficiently. Nations are struggling to maintain cross-border liquidity certainty. Every major liquidity crisis creates one-truth systems that cannot adapt will eventually break. And when the system breaks, the world seeks alternatives. 2026 is the year where global liquidity pressure intersects modernization. This intersection forces adoption of new rails, and new rails require new settlement logic. This is why 2026 feels like a deadline. It is not a prediction, it is a structural timeline. Now let us move into the hidden signals long-term holders should watch. The first signal is increased institutional testing. When institutions test quietly, it means deployment is approaching. The second signal is accelerated regulatory clarity. When clarity improves, adoption becomes viable. The third signal is messaging harmonization. When financial language aligns, settlement must evolve. The fourth signal is corridor activation. When pilot corridors expand, the system is preparing for scale. The fifth signal is liquidity synchronization. When markets begin to expect real-time movement, the rails must support it. These signals become more visible the closer we get to 2026. Now let us explore the emotional impact of the shock. People will not be ready for a world where money moves instantly. People will not be ready for a world where borders lose financial meaning. People will not be ready for a world where banks no longer rely on outdated rails. People will not be ready for a world where tokenized assets settle in real time. People will not be ready for a world where digital liquidity becomes the norm. People will not be ready for a world where assets like XRP become infrastructural rather than speculative. This psychological shift is the shock. Now let us explore the final phase of the 2026 transition. The global realization that the financial world has permanently changed. At first it will feel subtle, faster payments, more efficient banking, less friction, less delay. Then it will feel structural. Corporations moving liquidity instantly, governments issuing digital currencies, banks abandoning pre-funding. Then it will feel irreversible. The old system cannot return. And when that moment arrives, the world will begin asking different questions. Not how to trade digital assets, but how to operate inside a digital financial system. Not how to chase volatility, but how to survive in a real-time economy. Not how to predict prices, but how to understand the rails moving beneath global markets. By the time the world asks these questions, the holders who understood the architecture will already be positioned, which leads to the ultimate truth of this script. The shock coming in 2026 is not about XRP. It is about the world finally becoming the environment XRP was engineered for. It is about the rails changing. It is about the system evolving. It is about liquidity becoming mobile. It is about settlement becoming instant. It is about institutions adopting invisibly. It is about the future quietly replacing the past. And XRP simply fits into that future. The real question is not whether the shock is coming. The real question is whether you understand the system well enough to recognize it when it arrives. Because 2026 will not bring a moment of celebration. It will bring a moment of realization. Realization that the world has changed. Realization that the rails are new. Realization that the system is different. Realization that the future has already begun. And when that moment comes, the only question left will be, are you ready? People will feel confused when the financial system behaves differently. People will feel overwhelmed when settlement becomes instant. People will feel unprepared when tokenized markets become standard. People will feel surprised when institutions rely on digital liquidity flows. People will feel lost when old assumptions collapse. And during this confusion, the world will begin searching for clarity. And assets that were dismissed for years will suddenly be reevaluated. This is why 2026 becomes a defining moment, not because something magical happens, but because the world wakes up to what already happened. In the second half of this script, we will explore the liquidity implications, the institutional adoption timeline, the settlement pathways, the hidden signals, the cross-border transformation, and the psychological shift that will determine who survives the 2026 shock and who gets left behind.